Hi, I'm Dr. Edd Schneider. This is my presentation, Tactile 3D Game Design, from the International Visual Literacy Association's 43rd Conference in Galloway, New Jersey. What's my presentation about? Well, the idea is that my students make games, and then they fine-tune the way those games work with elements that they make out of papercraft. Essentially, they make 3D objects on the computer and then get them out of the computer through paper folding and desktop publishing. Making games, and especially making video games, is difficult. Even though making games to humans is a very natural activity, planning the details of a game specifically is hard. It's a process that requires a lot of planning. And so this hopefully will make the process more natural for my students because they're making objects that they can hold and manipulate and talk about without being hunched over a keyboard. This is a game that was one of the motivators and got me thinking about using papercraft for game design. It's something called HeroClix, and I actually play this with my daughters who are 4 and 6. When I was younger, people played Dungeons and Dragons, just basically using paper and some dice and imagination. This is an update to traditional role-playing where the actual rules are built into the characters. And if you look at the base of each one of these guys, you can see that there are numbers down there, and there's actually a wheel that spins to keep track of how much damage each one can do and how healthy each one is. And I thought, hey, this is the game mechanics going into the toy pieces themselves. We can do this with papercraft. And that was the thing that got me started thinking about incorporating this project into my desktop publishing class. So what are we going to see in my workshop today? First, examples of games and projects made with papercraft. I want to show how this procedure can apply in a lot of different academic domains, not just math or science. I have some examples from music and English and other fields. I want to talk about what game mechanics are. When you're getting students to do video games, it's important that they really think about how the world that they're making works. And so making papercraft helps them get those details right. And so I'll talk about play mechanics. And lastly, I want to talk about how to take 3D objects from the computer space into the real world space. That is the development technology at the core of this project, and I want to make sure everyone here knows at least how to do it, and even if you can't specifically do it when you leave the workshop, you'll at least be able to look it up yourself. I'll point you towards resources that can guide you through the papercraft process. So let's look at our first example. This example is from geology. Imagine that you're a chemistry or geology teacher and you're trying to teach students about gemstone cleavage or crystal cleavage, how a rock breaks down. Well, this turns into what's called a shape called the Ditetragonal Dipyramid, which is a way a particular type of gem or rock breaks down. One of these is okay. You could show students what this type of cleavage is better than, I guess, a diagram. But imagine if you gave every student this and asked them to cut out and fold 2 or 3 of them, bring them to class the next day. Well, then all of a sudden you have 60 of these things. And so then you can show students how, for instance, when a crystal shatters, how it shatters. How was it together before it shattered? And so therefore, an example of papercraft in geology. Next up, an example from math. In math, and especially in algebra and arithmetic, there's a game called the 24 game. The way this game works is students roll, I think it's 3 of these, which is a 12-sided dice, and then with numbers obviously 1 to 12 on it. And so then they have to take those 3 numbers, which is from 1 to 12, and arrange them with 2 more dice, and I think this is an 8-sided dice I'm about to show you. Okay, hold on. But this 8-sided dice has arithmetic expressions on it, and so you have to arrange this in the 12-sided dice in order to make the number 24. But again, you're a math teacher. You want to play the 24 game, but how many sets of the 24 game can you honestly afford? Well, as long as you have printing and maybe spring for some card stock, you can have as many sets of the 24 game as possible, and if it gets smashed or broken, you make a new one. This is one of my favorite ones from music. And if you're learning the violin, one of the things that they're going to teach you is that you're essentially supporting the weight of the violin with your jaw. And so that's why I was really excited when a student made essentially a papercraft violin. Here it is. I think it's technically she has a cello, I guess, but it's really the size of a kid-sized violin. And so therefore, the game is, learning to hold a violin correctly. How long can you hold it? These kinds of things. But a great example of making a toy or an object that emphasizes a learning goal. That we're learning the ergonomics of how to hold the violin. This is back more into the pure game zone. One of an area of English is medical transcription. I had a student who is a full-time teacher who teaches a course on medical transcription, which is an important subject. Essentially, it's reducing. It really involves reducing medical error, getting students to, if a student is a nurse and is writing down what's wrong with a patient, let's say, to get that correct. So I had a student named Jeffrey Ohm who came up with this. This is called MedView. It teaches essentially word analysis, how to break down medical terms by chunks and learn them. And on the right, you're seeing cards, and the dice is to the left. I forget exactly how it plays, but it's pretty awesome. Way essentially to engage students with a different form of learning through games. Let's take a look at a puzzle game. Not everyone in my class obviously wants to go into teaching. I have some industry-oriented students, so this is one I'm actually shocked they've not made in real life. Tetris blocks. So therefore, this student made a game that plays like Tetris, except for made out of papercraft. And I'll get back to this project later on. An example from history, although maybe this isn't necessarily history as games or instruction. The Frederick Remington Art Museum is located in our region. Frederick Remington, the artist, is from here. He's a famous artist who did generally bronzes, is what he was known for, bronze sculptures of Western scenes. He's also a painter. I did a workshop for them about a year ago, I guess, called Can You Build Fred's Head? Essentially where I had students build a papercraft version of Frederick Remington's head, essentially a bust, the kind of thing you would see in a house at that time. So an example from history. I also use papercraft in my own artwork, even though I do research like a traditional academic. I also do pursue juried art exhibitions as time allows, and so I've done a couple pieces for gallery shows out of papercraft. This piece is called A Mounted Head of a St. Lawrence River Giant. It's about 4 feet tall, and I illustrate essentially on top of the papercraft. This is a silly one. I like to show this one for kids for imagination. I wanted a squid riding a locust. So here's a squid riding a locust. So who is this for? Well, it's for entry-level media production students, as the slide says. Basically, I don't have a prereq. The course that contains this project is a graduate-level instructional technology desktop publishing course. And so I wanted to say to my students, what makes this course graduate level? And so therefore getting into game design and papercraft and stuff was partially an effort in that direction. But at the same time, none of these students have a design background, or some might, but there's no requirement for having a design background or a technical background going in. So what are our goals? Well, first goal is to emphasize the importance of planning. You have to plan your game. You have to plan the pieces carefully. You can't just jump on a computer and start clicking away. You really, really have to plan, and it's sort of stretching out, not pointlessly, but stretching out the planning process, formalizing the planning process. Second goal is to make students use these tools precisely. You have to make sure your angles line up. You have to make sure your line lengths are the same. It's just, you have to use the tools precisely. When someone is first learning how to use Photoshop or Illustrator or a 3D modeler, there's a lot of clicking and dragging. You'll notice when someone gets really good at these tools, it's a lot of entering numbers numerically, controlling things using the keyboard rather than the mouse. And so it's kind of an effort to push them in that direction. You have to do it that way. And lastly, just getting them to visualize and plan their gameplay experience. Really, when you're talking about a game, and I don't mean to sound too spacey, but I tend to think of it as a fifth-dimensional construct. And so therefore, allowing students to sort of physically put themselves inside the game space with real-world objects helps them visualize that fifth-dimensional space, essentially, that they're making for the game. So what are gameplay mechanics? Like, what am I specifically talking about with this? Well, these are the details. Gameplay would be, in volleyball, you're hitting the ball back and forth over the net. Gameplay mechanics are the lines around the outside saying the ball can't go out. Or in a shooter game, the gameplay is two people shooting guns back and forth at each other. The gameplay mechanics are how many times they can get hit. So specifically the rules of the game, and really design enjoyment to enhance enjoyment. Although maybe if your game has a learning goal or something, it might be the mechanics might be modified for another goal. So some basic examples. Points. How many points do you have? I mean, that's one of the most basic gameplay mechanics there is. Achievements. And this is something that we've seen more and more coming back. But a lot of these concepts aren't really as new as you would think, like combos. When I say combos, my mind instantly goes to Street Fighter and the Street Fighter games, which have these ridiculous, what they call combos. But if you want to go backwards to something as simple as checkers, you jump someone in checkers, and then you can jump someone else in checkers on that same turn. That's a combo. And so again, if in your game, do you want to include these kinds of things or not? And so planning gameplay mechanics. All right. There's also more advanced mechanics, things like infinite gameplay, something like in Tetris, where if you do the right thing, you can continue to play theoretically forever. We're seeing more and more of these kinds of things, community collaboration, stuff like Minecraft, if you're familiar with that game, where people just work together to build something. And another example of an advanced mechanic is epic meaning, World of Warcraft. We're all getting together for our guild. What I'm doing in this game has meaning beyond me, beyond this game. Epic meaning. Strange for some of us, but it's a growing mechanic. And then lastly, victory condition mechanics. How do you win? Do you need a certain number of points? Do you need to get rid of all the enemies? Do you need to build something of a certain height or a certain size? Did you win a race? Or if the game has a different goal, something like meeting a learning objective. In the violin, the game is essentially to hold it correctly, and so maybe you have held it correctly long enough. So how do you win the game? All right, so that's the mechanics and how we're going to use the papercraft to plan. How are we going to build these things? Well, the idea is that there's going to be two paths for development. One is using traditional desktop publishing tools, and the other is 3D modeling. So when people take path one, they're using the desktop publishing tools. It's a technically simpler path, but it's a mentally more challenging path, I guess. The spatial relationships and manipulations are all going to be done in the student's mind. And so that's why if someone chooses path one, I don't feel like I'm cheating them technically. Path two is when students actually make the objects on the computer and then turn them into papercraft. So essentially they're doing 3D modeling and then running it through a program, in our case called Papercraft Designer. So let's go back to path one again. This path emphasizes spatial thinking. The student has to visualize in their mind how their shape wraps around, how the pieces of paper are going to fold together. And it also, as I talked about earlier, it emphasizes precision. They've got to get these line lengths right. They've got to get the angles right, and they also have to keep scale across multiple pages of a document, which can be tricky at times. And so two of the examples I showed, the 24 game, but also the Tetris game. The Tetris game was also made this way. They were using traditional desktop publishing tools, but you got to remember each one of these shapes was on a separate piece of paper, yet they're all the same size. They all used the maximum area on the paper, and each one of these shapes was made as one piece. I was really impressed with this. And so again, even though she didn't 3D model these shapes, mentally the type of manipulations she was doing were still fairly challenging. So let's talk about the second path. This is when we 3D model and skin our object. And so this is a more technically challenging path if you have engineers. This might be something that would be appealing for them, or you know, if I have computer science students, I'll push them this way. So first off, I use Blender. It's totally free. You can do motion graphics with it. You can do animation with it. And we're doing polygonal modeling, no curves in this case. We're really breaking it down into flat shapes, but totally free. And also, as part of it, the 3D modeler is free, but also, if you go to YouTube, there are thousands of tutorials on Blender. So not only is the application free, the training is free, which is a massive difference from 10 years ago, where the 3D modeler was a few $1,000s and the training was a few thousand more dollars. We're also going to use Papercraft tools. The two I've listed here are Papercraft Designer, and the other one's Ultimate Papercraft 3D. They're both really great. One is $38, and I think the other is $39. And so choose one, but that's your really only expense is in the Papercraft program right now. I don't know of a open source Papercraft program that's very good. And there's demos. You could use a demo as well. So here is an example of a PlayStation 1 game. You say, why would I put that there? Well, if you look closely at the characters, you're going to see a lot of polygonal shapes. You can see little squares and little triangles. And the type of 3D modeling that we're going to be doing in Blender in just a moment is very similar to the type of 3D modeling that people did on video games 10 or 15 years ago, where you really are trying to use the least number of polygons possible. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here's an example of Mario, and this is, I think, even from like a GameCube game, so he actually has quite a few polygons. And so, but you got to remember, each one of those squares has got to be cut around, got to be folded, got to be manipulated. And so as you're doing this, you really want to reduce the number of polygons possible, being used as much as possible. So our process. First, we're going to sketch a minimalist version of our object. We want to draw our object as simply as humanly possible. We're going to make a polygonal 3D model of that shape. And remember that you want to use textures to put as much on as possible rather than polygons, because textures will just be printed on the thing that comes out of the printer rather than having something that we have to cut and fold. Next up, we're going to texture it. And again, as I said, there are thousands of tutorials for Blender. And you can use the most basic 2D editor, Microsoft Paint, Photoshop, whatever you want to use to put your texture on, which will then travel with the 3D model as you export it as an OBJ. And that's why, as I said, I use Blender, but 3D Studio Max, Maya, Softimage, any of these programs will allow you to export an OBJ. You just want to make sure you're modeling as polygons, not as NURBs, not as curves, as polygons. And then once we get that OBJ out, we bring it into Papercraft Designer, and this is really, it's a desktop publishing program. And I'm really hoping that it maybe something like Adobe would buy Papercraft Designer and just put it into something like InDesign, or put it into something like Adobe Illustrator, because essentially it's just taking that 3D model and turning it into an object that you can manipulate on paper. Once we get it all set up in Papercraft Designer, and our end project from that is essentially a print document, we export that as a PDF into a program either such as Microsoft Publisher or Adobe InDesign. And this is where, as I said, this class that I teach this in is a graduate level instructional technology course. Papercraft Designer is going to give you shapes and folds and tabs, but it's not going to give you anything about how to put it together. And so for the final step for my students, and I think this is in many ways the most important step, is to create a guide, so that way if someone were to receive this document, they could understand what the document is and how to put it together. And that's a real challenge, that you have to sort of plan from the beginning. But the idea there is it allows them to think about, how would someone else interpret this document. And so now that I've explained the process, and again, for those of you who are just watching this on the internet, this presentation comes from a workshop. Then we'd go hands-on with laptops, and I'd take people through a very basic 3D model in Blender, and then we would take that 3D model through Papercraft. And it only really takes maybe an hour to explain to someone how to make a 3D model, basic 3D model in Blender, and how to flatten it out in Papercraft. So anyway, and again, my name is Dr. Edd Schneider. My email and information. I'm an associate professor at SUNY Potsdam, and there's my portfolio. So if you have any questions, get a hold of me. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.